All right, good morning, rather good afternoon. Uh, we'll go ahead and start on chapter 13 here. So again, hoping you're able to do your lab exam without any further problems there. Uh, for whatever reason earlier, it did not appear on time, but that has been taken care of. So I should be able to update all your grades that I already did yours as far as lecture exam number 3 is concerned. So that should all be put in. And I should be able to put the grades for this one by tomorrow. And yeah, any questions that might pop up at any time, please feel free to email and let me know. All right, so chapter 13, as we had mentioned before, is about the most fascinating organ of the human body, which is the brain itself, as you can see. So as is apparent on this slide, the brain, for ease of understanding and study, has been divided into these 4 regions. But that does not mean that these regions work in isolation from each other. Okay, they all work together. That's the thing to remember. And so there's no such thing that you only use 5% or 10% of your brain at any given time. It's a complete fallacy. So those are the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum, right? Let's start from the very base, the cerebellum, also called the mini brain. And I'll take you to the picture here. Right, actually, here we go. So let's see, right. Um, Here's the cerebellum. And as you can see, it is posterior-inferior or inferior-posterior, whichever way you want to put it. It's down here and on the back of the surface of the brain. This is the frontal end, also called the rostral end of the brain. This is the back part, the posterior region, also called the caudal region. Caudal region, caud means the tail, all right? So that gives you some reference. One thing to remember, if you see the cerebellum sticking out from here, you know this is the posterior view of the brain automatically, and this one would be anterior. On top of that, you see the characteristic features, these convolutions, worm-like convolutions that you see. These are called sulci, sulcus for, rather gyrus for singular, and gyri for plural, right? And these raised convolutions are interspersed with these deep grooves within, deep cracks, fissures, whatever you're going to call them. And they are called sulcus, singular sulcus, plural sulci. Okay, so gyri and sulci. And why the brain has this convoluted appearance? Because the human brain is tremendous, right? In terms of 100 million times 100 million neurons and connections that we talked about before. So that much matter has to be squeezed in an organ which is about 3 pounds by weight. So in order to do that, you literally had to fold layer upon layer upon layer of the brain. If you look at our closest uh, companions or relatives in the animal kingdom, the chimpanzees, their brain, their cerebrum, or the gyri and the sulci are nowhere close to what human brain looks like, all right? So just give you a rough idea. Uh, the human brain, um, well, let's start with the chimpanzee brain first. So the chimpanzee brain, when fully developed, is about the size of a postage stamp in the skull, okay? Just a rough comparison. If you look at the white and the gray matter of the human brain, it's like taking 3 full stacks of copy paper, stacks of copy paper is what I'm talking about, and crumple them all and then try to squeeze them in our skulls, all right? So a postage stamp sized surface area versus 3 stacks of copy paper. That is the amount of difference that we have from our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom, okay? So tremendous amounts of gray matter and white matter in there. And we'll talk about the difference between those two as well. All right, so cerebellum. This area is called the cerebrum, the gyri and the sulci. We talked about those, front end, back end. You have 5 lobes here: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobes, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe. Okay, right there. So then comes the brain stem here. Brain stem is made up of the midbrain at the very top. Then this protrusion called the pons, which literally means the bridge, which it's the bridge between the midbrain and the last part, or the most inferior part of your brain stem, called the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is right here. It continues downwards as the spinal cord. Now within the brain, deep inside, you have a buried mass called the diencephalon. Okay, If you look, go back to the slide here. Where is it? There. uh, Diencephalon, right? And that includes some of the vital structures that control our endocrine and nervous systems, like hypothalamus and pituitary gland, and also pineal gland, which is a part of the region called the epithalamus there. All of them are embedded deep within the brain, okay? So you're looking at the brain from an inferior view, okay? Again, cerebellum. Those are cranial nerves. Remember, we talked about 12 pairs of cranial nerves. You can see them emerging from the from the brain here. All right, those are the cranial nerves you can see. Okay, then what? Then you have the medulla oblongata. There's the pons, and then the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, the brain stem, right? You can see the temporal lobes of the cerebrum on the sides here, your eyeballs, of course, and those are the optic nerves. The optic nerves uh, come together at the optic chiasm, as you can see here, all right? And then they continue their journey all the way back to the occipital lobe. That is the visual part of the brain, as you can see here, okay? This is your diencephalon that I was talking about. So look at that pituitary gland, extremely important. Remember, it was in the sella turcica, the bony box that we mentioned before. Here it is, the pituitary gland. So my patient that I talked about, the 75-year-old guy who had lactation and gynecomastia and all those things, this was the area that we had to work on, okay? All right, what else do we have here? So here's your smelling apparatus, the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tracts. Your olfactory nerve is your cranial nerve number one. That's the olfactory nerve. This is your nerve number two, optic nerve, okay? Number one, number two. The third one is your oculomotor nerve. So they all control the eyes, as you see here, okay? So here you have dissected the brain in a sagittal view and you're looking at it from the side, right? What do we have? Frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe at the top, and the temporal lobe here. Here's your cerebellum. Here's your midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. This is your diencephalon. This egg-shaped region, it's called the thalamus. So look for this egg-shaped region, this orbital region here, right? Uh, the function of the thalamus is to act like the post office of the brain, the so-called post office, okay? And why it's called the post office of the brain, because all these sensations first come here for being relayed to the appropriate, just like a post office sorts all the mails and stamps them and puts them into different envelopes, different carriages to take to their respective um, residential addresses or wherever. That's the same thing that the thalamus does. All right, so it takes up all the incoming sensations and sends them to the appropriate parts of the brain. Just below the thalamus here is the hypothalamus. Hypo means below, so hypothalamus, and it has famously been referred to as the four F's guy, the four F's. So what are those four F's of the hypothalamus? The first F is for feeding. The second F is for fighting. The third F is for fleeing. And the fourth F is for something I cannot say aloud in public. Let's call it sex. Okay, but you get the idea what that fourth F is for. So feeding, fighting, fleeing, and sexual activity. Those are the four primal functions or primal instincts that are basically contained within here, this part of the brain, the hypothalamus, okay? In addition to these primal instincts, which obviously help us preserve our species, any mammal to preserve their species, it's also the thermostat of the brain. It's also your food and thirst regulatory center, okay? It also secretes many hormones that control the pituitary gland at its base. So it's pretty much the chief organ of the brain, the hypothalamus, one of my favorite areas, right? And then just posterior to it here is the pineal gland, and the pineal gland secretes a hormone called melatonin, which puts you to sleep. Melatonin is your sleep hormone right from here, okay? And there's a pituitary gland, okay? So what you're seeing here, this white matter, is something called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is extremely important because this is the connection between two halves of your brain. Remember, the brain is divided into a right and a left half. And the two halves are connected by means of the corpus callosum. So in Albert Einstein, one other difference that was noticed in his brain was his corpus callosum was quite thick. It was much thicker, about 3 times thicker than an average brain. Corpus callosum of Albert Einstein, than an average male brain, that is. Females generally, on an average, seem to have a thicker corpus callosum as compared to males as is. So they can make sense of both their brains better. Seems like males are more focused on one area, right? Okay, what else do we see there? So yes, those are these structures that we just mentioned. You can see them. Okay, TBI, for traumatic brain injury. That's next. Three types that we have to remember: concussions, contusions, and lacerations. What is a concussion? You hit something, your head hits against anything. Uh, the jarring of the skull is jarred side to side. It results in your brain basically sliding within the brain case and hitting the walls, the bony walls of your skull. And that can give you a concussion. You might lose consciousness or feel faint, drowsy, maybe nauseous for a little bit, but concussions usually resolve on their own without any permanent neurological damage, unless they happen over and over again. If that happens, then you can end up with something called the second impact syndrome. It happens in football athletes quite a lot, right? Because they get these repeated, or boxers, repeated knocks to the head, and that can result in fatal consequences because the brain is already swollen because of all the knocks it has taken. And so this rapid swelling of the brain basically will cause uh, your, because it cannot expand outwards, right? All that fluid, so it has to put its pressure inwards, and it causes your brain stem to be squeezed shut. And your brain stem is where all of your vital functions, like your respiratory rate, your heart rate, your pulse, everything is regulated from there. So when that is crushed, uh, it's game over, basically. Okay. Contusion is more serious, where your brain has actually literally distorted because of a more serious injury, a car accident or something, where your skull was violently like thrown around. That can cause an actual contusion and bleeding within the brain. And some neurological damage is always there, like paralysis, speech problems, memory problems, or movement problems, those kinds of things. Okay. The final one is laceration. Laceration is the worst of all, which basically means that a sharp object has, or blunt object with great force has actually penetrated the bony skull and has cut into the tissue of the brain itself. So it's an actual gash or a wound on the brain. And there's all, if not death, there's always some serious permanent neurological damage following that. All right. Okay, so here we are looking at something called neurulation, which means the formation of the central nervous system in humans. And remember, the central nervous system is an offshoot of your ectoderm. We talked about that before. Very simple. In blue, you have the ectoderm. In red, you have the mesoderm of the embryo. And in yellow, you have the endoderm, the three primary germ layers, okay? So what's happening with the ectoderm? See, it's kind of like moving downwards. The cells start migrating in between, and it forms this like almost a semi-hole called the neural groove, as you can see here. Finally, the cells take over all around, and then you end up with something called the neural tube. This has become a neural tube. What are we trying to form here? A spinal cord, eventually, in the brain, right? All right, so at this time, if the pregnant woman, the mother, is like a heavy smoker or is low on folic acid, isn't keeping up with her folate intake, then you can suffer from these conditions like anencephaly, which means that the brain is either not fully developed. Sometimes the skull is not formed properly, and you can see the brain protruding out there in more severe cases of anencephaly, and that's obviously incompatible with life. Or spina bifida, in which your spinal cord kind of pokes out from your vertebral column, from your backbone, right? It hasn't fused together perfectly. So that's what we're looking at here. That's why it's so important to take your prenatal vitamins, vitamin B12, folic acid, all the minerals. Have a well-balanced diet when you're pregnant, because you don't want to end up with any of these conditions. Spina bifida cystica. This is more serious, where part of the spinal cord might actually protrude out, be prone to infections, and paralysis is quite common here. Or you can have spina bifida occulta, which is a much lesser defect and which is compatible with more of a normal life there, okay? All right, so here let's take a look at some of the structures that are found in a 4-week-old fetus and how they form. In the very front, you have the prosencephalon, which is going to turn into what? Your cerebrum, basically, the cerebral hemispheres, right? Mesencephalon, which would be your midbrain, right? A rhombencephalon, this would be your posterior brain, and your brainstem and cerebellum from here, okay? Okay, 5 weeks, same structures here. Now, they are called, again, this one is your telencephalon. This will become your cerebral hemispheres, the bulk of the brain, right? Diencephalon, this will form your pituitary gland, your hypothalamus, and your pineal gland. Then what? The metencephalon, this will form your midbrain, and also your what? Your pons. And then the myelencephalon all the way in the back, which will form your medulla oblongata and the spinal cord, okay? All right, so here, 13-week-old fetus, and then 26 weeks. Look at the structures. They are almost adult-like now, right? You see the cerebrum at the top, see the brainstem with the pons, the medulla oblongata, the midbrain over there, the cerebellum or the mini brain in the back, all of them. You can see them here. And this baby is ready for birth, and he or she has a completely human brain, like an adult brain as you know it, right? So the cerebrum, again, the same parts as you can see here. All right, what a well-formed organ, and it's marvelous whenever you look at this miracle of birth, right? And the beauty and complexity of this organ. Uh, it's mind-boggling. All right, no amount of evolution makes sense of anything like this. Okay, it's a deep subject if you get into it. So, all right, without getting too distracted, let's go ahead and look at these two types of brain tissues that you have. Gray matter versus white matter. What's the difference? White matter is those neurons and axons which are surrounded by the whitish myelin sheath. We talked about myelin sheath yesterday. It's made up of lipids, fats, sphingolipids. And so that makes the white matter. Gray matter is naked neurons or neurons or cell bodies which do not have the myelin sheath around them. That's called the gray matter, okay? And so it's also in common parlance, right? It's a manner of speech, use your gray matter. So that means, and here you can see where the gray matter is. It's on the outside. It forms the cortex of the cerebral hemispheres. This is the cerebral cortex. All this gray stuff here, those are the naked neurons, if you will, without the myelin sheath, called the gray matter, okay? All this white stuff, that's myelin sheath. And so which ones are faster? Myelinated ones, right? So that's not to say that this is the dumb area, by far no. This is the thinking part of your brain actually, but it's not shooting. This is what's generating original thought. Your creative thought, your original thought is being generated in the cerebral cortex over here. But how you're communicating that thought to different parts of the brain, that's a function of your white matter. And Albert Einstein was an expert. He was a champion, a genetic champion at that. He got his white matter really set up to take him to the next level, right? So it's nature was being unfair there. Not really, because he had his own price to pay, right? So there's a fine line between genius and madness, and the same brain traits that make you that extraordinarily bright also predispose you to mental conditions like schizophrenia. One of his sons was, of Albert Einstein's sons, was schizophrenic. So severe schizophrenia to where he had to be institutionalized all of his life, and they didn't get along too much, right? He wasn't too fond of his dad for whatever reason, and Albert Einstein didn't even visit him much, according to records and archives, till he died in his institution, right? So, so there you go. The same gene that makes you that brilliant also predisposes. You're walking a fine line there, so it's good to be average. I think I mentioned it before, right? An average man is a successful man, is what I say. So, all right. So one of the professors that I listen to often, Robert Sapolsky from Stanford University, is a neuroscientist, a very knowledgeable and entertaining speaker. You can find him on YouTube. So he says about the smart brains that get it right, and you will not have to go to school or your work on that person's birthday, right? Get it wrong, and then you end up in a mental institution. So that's a profound saying if you think about it, right? So in other words, he's saying all of these geniuses and these enlightened people, or in philosophy or religion, they were on that fine line, the very outer limits, the high limits of their critical cognitive function, right? Almost otherworldly. But if you tip a little bit more into the other side, then you need treatment there. All right. So here you can look at the cerebellum, which has been dissected for you. This looks like a what? It looks like a transverse section. Yes, that's what it is. So now the cerebellum here, you again see the white matter, the gray matter on the outside, and the white matter within, right? You also have this area called the arbor vitae, which arbor is for tree, vitae means life. So the tree of life, literally, kind of looks like a tree. See, twigs, like a Christmas tree. And so the arbor vitae, again, is the white matter of the cerebellum. It helps you solidify your memories, your muscle memories, such as when driving a car or playing a game of ping pong. They're all stored here. Any damage to the cerebellum, like a big bad blow to the back of your brain or back of your head, or a stroke affecting that area, and you lose your essential skills. And then you have to relearn how to walk, how to talk, how to drive, all of those things. It's all located here. And then at the bottom, you see the brain stem, right? The brain stem, again, is made up of those three regions that we have talked about before. All right, so here again is your medulla oblongata, which is the inferior most part of your brain stem, which is this gray matter on the inside and the white matter. I'm sorry, the gray matter on the outside and the white matter on the inside. Now, here you have a transverse section of the spinal cord. And what do you notice? You see that the gray matter is actually inside here. It's inwards in the form of the English letter H. You see it here, while the white matter is all on the outside. So there's a reversal. There's a reversal of the situation and location of the white and gray matter as you move down from the brain to the spinal cord. And that is an important impact on your body. These fibers, they actually cross over, they crisscross, right? They go across. So consequently, the right hemisphere of your brain controls the function of the left half of the body and the left half of the brain. So it's contralateral. It controls the contralateral side, okay? What are the four major regions of the brain? Cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, and brainstem. How does the neural plate form a neural tube? By dipping in of the ectodermal cells. We saw that. Identify the five secondary vesicles: telencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, myelencephalon. List the adult brain structures they form. We talked about those too. Where is gray matter located within the cerebrum? On the outside, in the cortex. In the spinal cord, it's on the inside, in the form of the English letter H. All right, next up, you're looking at the protective coverings of the brain. Here they are, the three meninges, all right? They're called the maters, M-A-T-E-R, mater, not matter, mater. That's Latin for mother, the mother membranes, right? Okay, let's look at their position. So first you'll see the skin of the scalp on the very outside here, underneath which you see the periosteum, which is the fibrous membrane surrounding the actual brain of the actual bones of the skull, which you see here. Here's the bone. Just below the bone, you see the first what? The first meninges called the dura mater. Here it is, the dura mater. Okay. Underneath the dura mater, you have the second part of the meninges, and that is the arachnoid mater here. And underneath the arachnoid mater, all the way here in pink, is the final one, pia mater. Okay. Now, also notice that in between the skull bone and the dura mater, you have this little tiny space, which is called the epidural space before the dura mater, right? Then just underneath the dura mater and in between the dura and the arachnoid mater, you have a subdural space, right? Then here's the arachnoid mater. Just below the arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space here, and then the pia mater here, okay? Also, there are many important clinical applications of what those spaces are and how they function. So first up, any injury to the brain, right? Or if your neck is contorted or twisted around or something at a violent speed, like for example, in a car accident or something like that, right? So these blood vessels here in this area rupture, and the blood can accumulate either here in the epidural space, or here in the subdural space, or down here in the subarachnoid space. Those are all possible. Which one is most dangerous? Epidural hematoma, which is a blood clot or collection of blood, a subdural hematoma, or a subarachnoid hematoma? Okay, which one? The answer is epidural hematoma. Why? Because if there's a large body or blood clot accumulating here, it cannot put any pressure above because you have the solid bone of the skull, right? So where does all the pressure transmit then? Down here. And when you push these meninges down, they're going to squeeze your brain, and then your spinal cord and your brainstem will be squeezed too, and that means death, cessation of your respiration and your heartbeat. Okay, and so the epidural hematoma is the most dangerous. The subdural one and the subarachnoid one, since there's no bone here involved, it's soft tissue, they still have room to expand, so they don't cause that much of a squeeze and pressure symptoms on the brain. Okay. Now, if you look at the names, dura mater, it's durable, it's strong, the outermost, so therefore the name. Arachnoid mater comes from the from arachnids. What are arachnids? Eight-legged creatures like spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites, right? And if you take one look at the subarachnoid space, you will understand why it's called the arachnoid mater. Look here. Those kind of look like spider, either cobwebs or spider legs, something like that, right? And basically that's why this is called the subarachnoid space. This is a very important area of the brain because this is where you have this clear fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. And cerebrospinal fluid provides nutrition, removes waste, and basically sustains your brain. It's right here, okay? Pia mater is intimately attached to the structure of the brain itself. It's almost impossible to differentiate from the brain itself. You see it here. There's your subarachnoid space going all the way down, filled up with cerebrospinal fluid. All right. Here is a tent-like connective tissue area called the falx cerebri, which divides the left and right hemispheres of the brain. You can see it here, right? And these are the veins of the brain called the sinuses, dural venous sinuses. These are the veins of the brain that drain blood from the brain. For example, this is the superior sagittal sinus. These kind of like, what are these protrusions here? Called the arachnoid villus, or finger-like projections. Villi are finger-like projections, right? These arachnoid villi, they reabsorb the cerebrospinal fluid, right? The cerebrospinal fluid is reabsorbed and recycled and filtered out by the arachnoid villi, or arachnoid villi. You see these here in this picture as well. Okay, so we talked about that epidural hematoma, a blood clot, subdural hematoma. Which one is more dangerous? Meningitis. What is that? Infection or inflammation of your meninges. Okay, what causes it? Many types of bacteria, viruses, even fungi. Okay, um, so to be a college student, you need to show your documentation proving that you have gotten yourselves vaccinated against these common meningitis causing organisms, right? These are the signs and symptoms, as you can see here. Um, so a stiff neck, high fevers, right? Nausea, vomiting, photosensitivity, being sensitive to light, all of those are signs and symptoms. Who is more likely to get these kinds of infections, meningitis? People where lots of people, a large number of people are thrown together in close proximity, like in college dorms, concerts, games, right? Uh, Theaters, religious gatherings, any kind of place like that. Wherever you have COVID-19 concerns, you have meningitis concerns as well there. And if it's bacterial, it's treatable. If it's viral or fungal, you can treat it with antifungals as well. If it's viral, then the treatment is mostly supportive because, or you can use certain antivirals to lessen the severity of the signs and symptoms there. Okay. Now, one thing that basically is a hallmark feature of meningitis is projectile vomiting. Okay, projectile vomiting, which means the person vomits under great force. So there's like a stream, a jet stream of vomit that like flies quite some distance instead of just dribbling down. This is characteristically seen in meningitis sufferers. Okay, and I will also mention some common bacteria that can cause meningitis. First one is Neisseria meningitidis, okay, closely related to Neisseria gonorrhea, which causes the STD, the sexually transmitted disease called gonorrhea, and also Haemophilus influenzae, okay, another bacterium that is commonly responsible for meningitis. All right, um, strep. You can also have meningococcemia or meningococcal meningitis, okay, because of gram-positive bacteria as well. Encephalitis is when this meningitis infection spreads to your brain tissue as well and involves your cerebral cortex and parts of the brain. Then it becomes encephalitis. All right. All right. So here we are looking at what are called the cranial dural septa. So let's go here and take a look at what those look like. All right. So here they are, and they basically are these partitions that you see uh, separating the brain into different compartments and different chambers, right? So let's take them one by one as we see here. The first partition made up of this meningeal connective tissue, something called falx cerebri, all right? And you can see why it's called that, because it runs, overhangs your cerebral hemispheres and basically divides them into right and left halves. You can see it there, right? Within the falx cerebri, you're also seeing this large vein running, which is called the superior sagittal sinus, all right? The superior sagittal sinus, because it's running in a sagittal direction, back to front, you can see, all right? And you can also see an inferior sagittal sinus here in this cadaver. That's an actual picture there. Okay, so then just underneath here, you have the pituitary gland area, the sella turcica or the diaphragma sellae, as you can see, important area, right? Okay, then in the back right here, you have this frontal kind of like an across type of partition called the tentorium cerebelli. So think of it like a tent-like area overhanging your cerebellum, right? Here's the cerebellum, the mini brain, and overhanging it is the tentorium cerebelli, as you can see. And within this structure, you have a transverse sinus. This was your sagittal sinus running in a sagittal direction. And here's your transverse sinus in the tentorium cerebelli. And then finally, all the way here in the back, this is the falx cerebelli, because it, again, it overhangs the cerebellum here, okay? And then you also have something called the occipital sinus, this little vein here. So all of these sinuses are actually veins, brain veins, that drain deoxygenated blood from the brain. So you see all of them here in this structure. Okay, next we are looking at ventricles of the brain. And what are ventricles? Ventricles are these hollow spaces which are filled with cerebrospinal fluid within the brain. So there's two of these lateral ventricles, right? You can see why they're called lateral, like side by side, one in each cerebral hemisphere, one on right, one on left, right? Then they come together here with the third ventricle, right? And what connects the lateral ventricles with the third ventricle is the something called the interventricular foramen, an opening through which the cerebrospinal fluid can run from here to the third ventricle. And then the third ventricle is finally connected with the fourth ventricle down here in the brainstem by means of an area called the cerebral aqueduct. It's kind of like a tube, like a drainage tube that takes the fluid from here down here into the fourth ventricle. So here again, you can see those structures, the two lateral ventricles, the interventricular foramen right there, right? Then the third ventricle, the cerebral aqueduct, and then finally your fourth ventricle down here. Okay, so then that is all for the formation of cerebrospinal fluid, right? It's kind of like, those are like the sprinklers of the brain. If you remember, we talked about the ependymal cells right here, right? The ependymal cells are the sprinklers of the brain, and they secrete or pump out the cerebrospinal fluid, which does what? It protects the brain. It also provides stability for the brain, and it also makes it lightweight. So the brain and the spinal cord are kind of surrounded by this fluid called CSF that keeps it lightweight, okay? So all of those functions apply here to the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so how is it formed? It's formed by the ependymal cells, and the ependymal cells are found here on structures called choroid plexus. Plexus is a network of capillaries. That's what it means, right? A network. Choroid plexus, which looks like this. Here is a blood vessel, right? Like an artery running. And this artery squeezes out blood, filters it out blood till it turns like a clear color, because all of the red blood cells and hemoglobin stays behind. And then these ependymal cells, they act like sprinklers. They sprinkle the cerebrospinal fluid derived from your blood all the way across the brain, okay? Here they are. These are the choroid plexuses in the lateral ventricles of the brain. You can see them here, okay? All right, so the sprinklers, again, choroid plexus. All right, so the question is, now in this picture, you can see where the CSF is produced in the choroid plexus, right? In the lateral ventricles, and then it basically circulates all around the brain. You see here? These arrows tell you where the cerebrospinal fluid is circulating all around the brain. The entire brain and the spinal cord are bathed all the time in CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, as you can see in this picture. Okay, but the question is, well, if your choroid plexuses and your ependymal cells are like sprinklers and they're sprinkling out cerebrospinal fluid, how come it doesn't just fill up your brain, right? Because whenever you have a shower head, you also have a drain at the floor, right? So the brain also has its own drainage system, and those are called arachnoid villi. Arachnoid villi, as you see here, right? Arachnoid, again, spider-like, and villi means like finger-like projections. So these are the structures that reabsorb the CSF within and recirculate it. Okay, so choroid plexus uh, make CSF, and the arachnoid villi reabsorb the CSF all around. Okay, hydrocephalus. This is a condition which literally means hydro water. Cephalus is head, so or brain. So water in the brain is what hydrocephalus is, and it's most prominently seen and dramatically seen in children up to 2 years of age. It's because their brain can still expand. They have the soft spot, so you'll have these kids with extremely large head, a disproportionately large head and a small body because so much of the CSF is accumulating in the brain. What might cause hydrocephalus? It's kind of congenital. It's there by birth. Congenital infections can kind of mess up with the drainage of the CSF in the brain, like chlamydia infection or syphilis infection, or even some other viral infections. They can all basically uh, clog out the drainage system of the CSF. So the brain fluid, which is CSF, keeps accumulating there, and you develop hydrocephalus. How do you treat it? You put a brain shunt, a tube in the brain, right? And then the other end of a hollow tube, and then the other end of the tube goes down to your abdominal cavity. So all of this extra fluid which accumulates in your brain is basically directed down within your abdominal cavity where it's harmless, or you might urinate it out afterwards, okay? So we talked about the blood-brain barrier earlier. And if you remember, this was formed by what? By the astrocytes, right? And the astrocytes form the blood-brain barrier, so harmful substances and toxins cannot gain entry to the brain from your bloodstream. Okay, so here, there's a blood vessel in the brain, and see how the astrocyte is extending these what are called perivascular feet, which literally perivascular. They surround the vascular system. They surround the blood vessel here, and they prevent the toxins from leaking out of here and affecting your brain. So from deepest to superficial, name the meninges. So the deepest one is the pia mater, over which would be the subarachnoid space. That is where you find CSF, above which would be the arachnoid mater, above which would be the subdural space, above which would be the dura mater, above which would be the epidural space, in that order. Where is the falx cerebri located? On top of the cerebrum. It like hangs like a tent over the cerebrum. What is its role? It carries the sagittal sinus, the main vein of the brain, one of the main veins of the brain. Where is the fourth ventricle located in the two hemispheres of the brain? How does it connect with the subarachnoid space? By means of the interventricular foramen, right? What are the three main functions of cerebrospinal fluid? Buoyancy, protection, nutrition. Where is CSF first produced? In your ventricles. Where does it circulate? All around the brain and the spinal cord. How does it get removed? Arachnoid villi. Remove it away. How does the blood-brain barrier protect nervous tissue? It prevents toxins and other chemicals from getting to your brain, okay, and affecting it. So now we are talking about the cerebrum, which is the most human part of the brain, if you will. Also the latest one to develop in evolutionary time scale, right? This is where you have your intelligence, your memory, as it says here, your personality, your love for music, art, literature, your creative talents, everything human about that is human about you is found here in the cerebral cortex. It also controls your movement, your interpretation of your five senses: taste, sight, smell, hearing, all of that. All right. Okay. So here, let's take a look at the cerebrum from the very top. Okay. And I like this picture because they've color coded the different lobes of the brain here. You can see them. So first up, here's the right side, the right hemisphere. Here's the left hemisphere. What divides the brain into those two hemispheres is this longitudinal fissure, which is a deep crack running in a sagittal direction all the way across, the longitudinal fissure, right? Uh, and in the middle, you also have the this deep crack called the central sulcus, this way. Everything in front of the central sulcus is the precentral area. Everything behind the central sulcus is the post sulcus area. Okay, post central sulcus area, as you can see. Okay, colors. These are your frontal lobes. Your frontal lobes contain your personality, your ethics, your sense of right and wrong, your decision-making ability, your critical thinking, everything, again, that makes you human is over here. Then these two in a different color are the parietal lobes. In the parietal lobes, you have the body movement center, which is called the primary motor cortex. And then you also have the primary uh, sensory system. All right, this is somatosensory cortex. Where are they found? Very simple. So here is your central gyrus. We talked about this before, right? So if you remember the central sulcus, not gyrus, this is your central sulcus. This thin strip of brain tissue right in front of it, right here, called the precentral gyrus, is where your primary motor cortex is. Okay, so all of your body movements are controlled by this narrow thin strip of brain tissue right here. Then just behind this central sulcus, this narrow strip of brain tissue is your post-central gyrus, and this is where you have all of your sensory information stored, somatosensory cortex. Okay, so movement in this narrow area here, and sensations in this little area here, this strip right behind the central sulcus. Now, uh, any stroke which occurs here in the precentral area, right, and uh, your movement will be affected. You might be paralyzed, you might be like stammering, or I mean, stuttering, or falling around, or something like that. All kinds of things are possible. If the stroke involves the post central gyrus over here, then you have problems with sensations. You cannot interpret sights and sounds and smells. Sometimes you hear colors, or you hear music in colors, or vice versa, because something has gone haywire in the brain up here. Okay, so all kinds of syndromes can result from there. Okay, so all right, here let's talk about the primary motor cortex as we see here in this picture. So what we are looking at here in this picture is something called the motor homunculus. Okay, so basically here is your primary motor cortex, which is your what? Your precentral gyrus. See, this is the fold of tissue right in front of the central sulcus, the precentral gyrus. Now what you notice here is that there's different body parts, and they are like arranged in a weird pattern all across, right? Starting from here all the way to the deeper parts, and then here, and then it dips inwards towards the corpus callosum again. Okay, what is this all about? Basically, the size of each individual body part that you see here represents um, how many nerves, motor nerves, and fine coordination, fine motor skills are found in those areas. Okay, so let's see. What are the two largest body regions that you see in this picture? The face, the tongue is disproportionately larger, and the hands. Okay, and it makes perfect sense as to who we are as humans. What did we say before? As humans, we are constantly reading each other's facial expressions, right? We rely a whole lot on picking up facial cues. And so no wonder that the motor control of our facial muscles occupies such a central space in the place in the motor homunculus, right? So we are intricately able to control our facial expressions in order to express emotions, how we are feeling. The tongue, same. We are the only species that can talk, right? Humans are the only species with an articulate speech. And so that is made possible because of this fine control over the tongue. No other animal has this, including the great apes, right? And then the hands, of course. The human hand is this unparalleled biological structure. Throughout the natural kingdom, natural world, right? We can use our hands to create art, civilization, architecture, tools, weapons, all kinds of things, right? So, and our fingertips are also one of the most um, adept. So if you play the guitar or the piano, or a writer, uh, a typist, whatever, you're using the dexterity of your fingers, right? Your hands, basically. And so it comes as no surprise that these are the most uh, abundantly supplied areas by means of motor nerves, the most represented in the primary motor cortex. So any uh, stroke or blood clot that affects this area of the brain, you'll get a poker face or paralysis of the face, right? Any stroke involving this area here, your speech will be slurred, problems with your speech. Here, your hand will be paralyzed, okay? All right, so then again, here we are looking at your somatosensory, primary somatosensory cortex, which would be your post-central gyrus. It's just behind the central sulcus as we saw in the picture, okay? Same thing, it goes all the way from the side and then to the inside, takes a dip within the brain. Now, look at the organs which are the most uh, widely represented here on the sensory cortex. Again, it's the face, most particularly your lips and your tongue and the teeth, this area, right? Again, also, if you look at your hands, very sensitive, right? Quite large as compared to the rest of the body parts. And then here's the foot. And if you look down here, there's a new addition that you did not see with the primary motor cortex, the motor homunculus. The genitals are also represented here. Here, this is your post-central gyrus, right? So I'm sure in the previous one, they also represented the pre-central. Yeah, there's your primary motor cortex in the pre-central gyrus. It was here, just ahead of the central sulcus. This one is just behind the central sulcus. Okay, again, being human. So let's go back to your infancy. I want to take you back to the time when you were an infant, all right, little child, or other children. You might have had your own children or children that you've observed. What do they do? Their instinct, as soon as they're born, what are they checked for by the OBGYN or the pediatrician? They're checked for a number of reflexes, all right? I'll mention two of them here. The rooting reflex and the sucking reflex, right? What is the rooting reflex? If you touch the corners of the mouth of the infant with your tongue or a nipple or anything, they will instinctively turn their head towards that, right? That's the rooting reflex, all right? And what do they do? As soon as they locate the object, they're going to start sucking on it, okay? The sucking reflex. So we are born instinctively with those two well-defined reflexes. If they're missing, then the central nervous system is damaged or not developed properly, like in anencephaly or severe cerebral palsy or something like that, right? Or a severe congenital infection. So the what do the rooting and the sucking reflex tell you? Nature has sent us equipped with the means to gather our nutrition, okay? So no wonder then, and even when the child is in the infancy stage, anything that you hand to them or they come across, what do? It goes to their mouth, all right? And so why are they just putting everything in their mouth, right? So uh, makes, it's kind of, and you always have to like kind of be on the lookout that they don't put something which might be harmful in their mouths, right? So it seems like a pervy thing to do, right? So they act like little pervs, right? Which they are not, okay? So I'm just use that term. What they're trying to do here is they're trying to taste their world. At that point, when they're in their infancy, their eyesight is not as well developed. In fact, your vision is one of the very last of the five senses to fully develop. They don't see their world. They make sense of their world by tasting, because look at the number of sensory nerves supplying your tongue, very sensitive, right? Even when you become an adult, you taste things with your tongue. Tongue is also used for like erotic activities and everything, right? Like a tongue kiss or something like that. Again, because it's so richly supplied by sensory nerves, very, very sensitive. If you drink a hot liquid or something, a scalding fluid, again, the tongue. Same with your lips. And what else? Uh, excuse me. On the lips and the face, right? The teeth, extremely sensitive. Therefore, kissing is a universal custom to express love or affection or respect or whatever, because it's highly sensitive, right? Um, in any injury to this area, it hurts a lot because there's more nerves here than any other, right? Okay, then what do the kids do when they're past that infancy stage of being little pervs and putting in their mouth? Well, they are still no less of a little perv, because then they start groping everything. You have to say, keep hands to yourself. Okay, everything they have to touch it, whether it's a hot stove or some poisonous insect or a venomous animal or whatever, they have to touch it, right? So now they're not seeing their world, they're tasting it still, but on top of that, now they're feeling their world. All right. So do not necessarily stop them from tasting and touching unless it's something that is obviously harmful. Of course, you want them to make this mental map of the world that they've come in. The more sensations that you provide to them, the better their brain will develop, the smarter they will become, the higher the IQ, the more uh, concrete there and the more well-defined and well-detailed their map of the world would be, okay? So their fingers also very sensitive, right? So anyone who has used their mouth and tongue and fingers would know those are the most sensitive regions, all right? And then finally, of course, the genitals, genitalia, once you reach puberty, in fact, even before puberty in your childhood stage, this area is quite sensitive, of course, right? And this it nicely correlates with, if you study psychology, the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, the famous Austrian psychologist and physician, right? Sigmund Freud's um, stages of psychosexual development, okay? If you ever study those, they fit in perfectly with what we are looking at here, okay? So he says that kids in the very beginning have an oral phase. They have an oral fixation, okay? Because of obviously they have to drink milk from the mother and all that. So everything goes to the mouth. Then from the oral stage, then they move on to anal stage when they learn how to control their bodily functions like a bowel evacuation and bladder evacuation and those kinds of things. And then they go into a latent stage in their preteen years, and then finally with puberty comes the final mature genital stage, okay? So he's not all that off the mark. If you look at the primary somatosensory cortex, it basically tells us who we are as a species, okay? All right, so on top of those, you also have what are called these association areas, okay? So what do we mean by that? Association areas help you make sense of the five senses. So for example, your visual association area is found in your occipital lobe, and seeing something is one thing, but making sense of what you're seeing is something quite different, okay? So if your visual association area is damaged for whatever reason, you might be able to see just fine, but you won't be able to make sense of what you're looking at. And this was illustrated quite dramatically in the case of this person who was born blind. They made a documentary on him. And he reached the age of 40 years, okay, without seeing anything in the world. And then they used the latest technology. They planted electrodes in his brain and a camera in the eyeball, so that he was able to see for the very first time, right? At that point, he was already 40 years of age. So, but what they noticed was what this guy was doing was he would look at a tree, he'll keep walking, and he'll run right into the tree, right? Um, so in other words, and when they asked him, could you not see it? He says, yeah, I see this is brown, this is like it's a tree and all that. But somehow, because he was unable, he was born blind, his visual association area never developed properly. So he could not put together the images with what they mean. So weird things happen. It might happen to someone who was not born blind as well. If you get like a knock to the head or a stroke that affects your visual association area, there you have it. Same with your auditory association area. Listening or hearing something is one thing, but making sense of what you're listening to is something else. And many people have problems with that as well, right? So you might be hearing a guitar or a musical organ, and you might not be able to identify what you're listening to. Or people might listen to some language that they used to understand before, but have no idea. They don't understand English anymore post-stroke, after stroke. Because the auditory association areas is not working. There have been instances of people learning new languages or understanding new languages that they've never heard before after a stroke. So there's a lot of studying to be done. Do they revert to the primordial brain or something where they have knowledge of all these languages? Who knows? So it's quite interesting to say the least, okay? Similarly, of the primary olfactory cortex, which helps you with what? With smelling, and it's actually in your temporal lobe. And the gustatory cortex, gustation is your taste, and that is in your temporal cortex as well, okay? The visual area is in the occipital cortex, back of the head, as we mentioned before. So the prefrontal cortex is that area of the brain that makes us uniquely human. Prefrontal cortex is the area that develops last, and that's why our teenage brains are so dangerous at times, right? So why are our teenaged brains are dangerous is because, as I said, the prefrontal cortex develops the last, right? Up all the way up until 25 years of age, it's still developing. However, your 4F's region, the hypothalamus, you were born with that perfectly functioning, right? So we're looking for food, sex, fighting, fear. These are primordial instincts that we all have. So till you are 25 years of age, you're primarily your hypothalamus, your emotional part of the brain called the limbic system that we look at here, is overriding your prefrontal cortex. And some people like psychopaths, some of these serial killers and all of them, studies have shown that many of them started doing their heinous deeds after they suffered a head injury that kind of severed their prefrontal cortex from their limbic system. In other words, they lost all control of their urges, okay? Other parts of the cerebrum were working just fine. So they knew how to hide their crimes, and they, at some level, they understand that it's wrong, but they can control their urges, right? So brains, cortex, and 4Fs. All right. So the Wernicke area is a region of the brain located in the left hemisphere, and that one is for language comprehension. So you need a properly functioning left hemisphere Wernicke's areas to understand language. All right. All right. So next up here, we're looking at autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. So ASD, as you can see here, is basically it's a spectrum, right? So when you use the term autism, you're not referring to a single entity. So there is like different gradations and variations on that spectrum. The statistics, as you see here, about 1 in 88 children here in the United States, many more across the world, of course. And this is a psychodevelopmental disorder that has to do with problems with social interaction, with the way the brain works, translating into social and academic life, and of course, many ramifications that come from it. So what causes it is still kind of like a mystery. There are many different factors that have been implicated, everything from diet to your environment, to your genetics, to childhood trauma, but there's not a single trait that basically, or a single common underlying factor that can be pinpointed here. All right, it does tend to run in families, so therefore there is, without any beyond any shadow of a doubt, there is a genetic component here. And also males, as you can see here, are disproportionately more affected than females. In fact, so much so that the British neuroscientist Peter Cohen, actually, he's cousin to the famous actor Sacha Baron Cohen. I'm sure you know him as the funny guy from all those. What was that movie? I can't remember right now. Yeah, he plays some funny character with the big mustache and everything. But anyways, yes. So his cousin Peter Cohen. Actually said that to be male is to be slightly autistic, okay? In other words, what he's arguing is that just the fact that you are male, right, that in itself predisposes you to being autistic, because the male brain is mostly focused on on tasks at hand, right? It's a very action-oriented brain, especially after the surge of testosterone, right? It is not very concerned with forming alliances and friendships and social interactions and those kinds of things and nurturing. Those are more of like stereotypically female traits, right? Uh, so he has this interesting theory. So if you get a chance to look into it, please do so, right? There are no like known treatments because we do not know what causes it in the first place, but behavioral therapy, sometimes medications can tamper down the expression of this entity, as we can see. Vaccines have not been found to have any relation, any type of vaccine to ASD or autism spectrum disorder, as we see here, okay? And again, if you are in the education field as I am, um, you come across quite a few of these kids, right, who are classified as SPED students for special education, and they tend to suffer from various degrees, various types of autistic uh, spectrum disorders, right? They can range from the very high functioning ones, such as the Asperger's syndrome sufferers, right? Immortalized by the Hollywood depiction that we all know as a Rain Man by Dustin Hoffman, right? Which was based on a real life character, Asperger's syndrome, to the very low functioning ones where you have to use like body restraints in order uh, for this individual not to harm themselves or others. Okay. All right. So here in this slide, what you're looking at are tracts. So the question is, what are tracts? Tracts are nerves which are running within the substance of the brain or the spinal cord itself. That's simple as that, right? Once that nerve emerges from the brain or the spinal cord, then it's called a nerve. If it's still embedded and running within the structure of the brain or the spinal cord, then it's called a tract, okay? So here we are looking at many different tracts which connect different regions of the brain together. It makes sense, right? All parts of the brain are connected together, as we can see here in this picture. So the three types of tracts are association tracts in pink, commissural tracts in blue, and projection tracts in green. What's the difference? Association tracts, as we see here in pink, connect different parts of the brain within the same hemisphere, right? For example, the frontal lobe connected to the occipital lobe. So what you're seeing in your occipital lobe, you're also thinking about it critically in your frontal lobe, or what you are smelling in your temporal lobe, you're also making sense of it in your frontal lobe. So those are all association tracts which join together the different areas of the same hemisphere, okay? So then what are commissural tracts? Commissural tracts actually cross across. They cross from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere and vice versa, right? So they can cross. And so they need the corpus callosum right here. Corpus callosum is what has these commissural tracts, which join the two parts of the brain functionally together. And finally, the projection tracts, as we see here, connect the higher centers of the brain with the lower centers, as you can see here. And this is an important association. So if you think about things like meditation or yoga or visual imagery, this is what you're trying to do, right? You are trying to call your projection tracts into action. In other words, so let's first write it down here: meditation, yoga, um, visual imagery, right? And and what? And projection tracts. Okay. So what you're trying to do is, okay, so what is meditation or visual imagery, right? So you're basically actively imagining at times a serene scene like a tropical rainforest or a beautiful waterfall or some ocean island where you're enjoying the sun, the sand, the sea, and romance and whatnot. So you just close your eyes and you imagine it in your cerebral cortex right up here. What happens? Those projection tracts communicate this sense of euphoria to your lower brain centers, to your brain stem here, which is responsible for overseeing your heart rate and your blood pressure and your respiratory rate. Next thing you know, your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure comes down, and your pulse goes down. Very healthy, right? That's what meditation does for you too. Actively using the higher parts of the brain to calm down your more vital, more basic visceral body functions like blood pressure and all that. And this is also called biofeedback. Biofeedback is actively using the higher centers of the brain to calm down and temper down the lower, the not the lower, I shouldn't say lower, but the more vital body functions, which are centered here in your brainstem, like again, pulse, heart rate, your vital signs. Okay, it works the other way around too. For example, let's say you uh, are feeling hungry, right? And hunger is right here, basically in your hypothalamus, right in the lower center of the brain. And the next thing you know, this hunger is communicated to your cerebral cortex, and you're even thinking ugly thoughts. You don't like the place where you are. You don't like the person who's sitting in front of you. You don't like anything because you're hangry, right? That's what they call it. So it works both ways. You can use your higher brain centers to control your lower brain, your vital body functions, but your vital body functions also have a feedback effect on your thinking. Studies have shown that if you sit in a room where there is a nice fragrance and air freshener or something going around, right? So let's see, uh, smell and mood study, let's call it that. Then uh, and then if you're given a questionnaire where you're asking questions about a certain person or a certain situation, you tend to be uh, very mellow and very nice in judging that person in that situation. You're very forgiving. Everything is fine if you're well fed in a nicely scented room. On the other hand, if you're hungry, sitting in a room where it smells like rotten eggs or something, right? They actually did this experiment. And then you're given a questionnaire, you tend to be extremely mean and give negative comments and judge harshly the person in front of you or the situation or whatever. So here, your lower vital body functions are actually influencing uh, your higher your cerebral cortical functions there, right? So it works in both ways, both directions. Okay, so what are we looking at here? Okay, so this is what is called cerebral lateralization, which basically means the two hemispheres of the brain, as you can see here, uh, they are more in tune with some different functions. For example, the right half of your brain, the right hemisphere generally is more artistic, more musically inclined, more spiritual, more creative, right? While your left hemisphere of the brain is where you mostly do your analysis and mathematical skills and scientific thinking and logical and rational thinking. It's all here, right? So people talk about whether you're more right-brained or more left-brained and things like that, which is a silly argument because uh, the two hemispheres of the brain do not work in isolation with each other, right? At any given time, you are using both the right and the left half of the brain equally, right? For example, you are appreciating, enjoying a beautiful musical piece by some great genius or whatever, and at the same time, you're analyzing, okay, what notes this person is playing then? Like, it's going high and low. So you're trying to categorize that as well, right? So you're and, and vice versa. For example, if you're doing a math problem, then the creative part of your brain is also thinking, oh, how does this math problem relate to, maybe I can use these ratios to color my room a certain color, or arrange objects in a certain way. So again, it's both of the hemispheres working together at any given time. Even so, just for fun's sake, I did take this online test, uh, and you can take them too. They're for free on Google about cerebral lateralization. And so what my results showed, and this was about like 10, 12 years ago. So I don't know if I changed since then. I don't know if I became more right brain or left brain. I'm not aware of that. Uh, but based on the results back then, I turned out to be a global thinker, which meant that I was using both halves uh, of my brain equally, right? Uh, which all people do. But some people, I guess, based on the responses that they give to that questionnaire, are deemed to be more like left brain or right brain or whatever, right? Uh, so it was good fun when I did it back then. All right, next we are looking at uh, a neurological disorder called epilepsy. And epilepsy is seizures and fits, okay? And epilepsy comes in many different forms, like what are called grand mal epilepsy, right? Versus what is called petit mal epilepsy, okay? So grand mal epilepsy is the typical epileptic attack that we all know of, right? You start having seizures and convulsions and you lose consciousness. You might bite your own tongue and those kinds of things, right? Petit mal epilepsy is also called absence seizures at times. And this could be very minor and even unnoticeable, like someone just talking to you and then they zone out for a few minutes. They're just blinking and blinking their eyes and staring off in space. And then when you talk to them and ask them questions, they don't have a recollection for those 10, 15 minutes and those kinds of things. So that's the other type of epilepsy. What causes it is a host of things. It could be genetic, it could be like a head trauma, it could be electrolyte imbalances, you might be low on sugar, it could be a viral infection, bacterial infection, it could be even a change of temperature, bright flashing lights. Different people have different triggers for it, right? Some of the commonly reported symptoms or something called an aura. An aura is sights, sounds, and smells that you get just before an attack happens, right? Uh, so some of the common ones reported is the smell of burning licorice or burning rubber, as an example. All right. And so that is a sign for these people that a major attack is on its way, something like that. Okay. But sometimes there's no aura either. So there are drugs that can treat and temper down these epileptic seizures, drugs like carbamazepine, right, and phenytoin, okay? And there are newer drugs now on the market as well, which have less side effects. In very extreme cases where medical management does not suffice, then you might resort to surgical intervention, like things like hemispherectomy, all right, like where you cut out that part of the brain that is triggering seizures. So how do you even know which part of the brain is triggering seizures? An EEG, where they have you wear that skull cap with all the electrodes attached to it, and EEG, electroencephalogram, is what will basically localize these haywire, haphazard electrical activity that's going on in your brain at any given time. All right. CVA, that stands for cerebrovascular accident or stroke. Um, Most commonly caused by a blood clot or a fatty plaque that is built up in your cerebral blood vessels. So there's not enough blood going to your brain. So a poor diet, lack of exercise, stress, lack of sleep, all of those things can contribute towards this, to a stroke. Okay. And stroke could, you can get silent strokes where you do not even realize that part of your brain has died out, right? Uh, but then you develop some weakness of an arm, or your memory becomes fuzzy, or you start stammering or stuttering, or you forget things. Those kinds of things can happen as well. Um, so very, and stroke, please do know, is the third leading cause of death, morbidity and mortality across the world, right after cancer and heart disease. So it's pretty up there, okay? So keep your blood pressure under control, keep your triglycerides, your cholesterol levels under control, okay? And some of the symptoms of a major stroke are like blurred vision, paralysis either on one side of the body or both sides, drooping of the face on one side, right? Your eye basically is also like partially shut on one side. And if you're trying to, as a neurologist in the ward, if you're trying to elicit any of those signs, you might ask the patient, extend both of your index fingers towards the patient and ask him to like squeeze both of them with both hands as hard as they can. And so the affected side, that their grip would be quite kind of weak. Ask them to smile. When they smile, would be like a lopsided smile grin, or their eye might be drooping to one side. So that shows you there's like unilateral uh, weakness, right? Muscular weakness. So you can also check for reflexes, right? Neurological uh, exam for stroke. And not all strokes happen that way. You might have like a mini stroke, something called a TIA, for transient ischemic attacks. This is a mini stroke which might last anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes. And basically, uh, what happens during that time is you become confused, disoriented, you might lose your orientation, and then everything comes back to normal. For example, a few years back, one of my family members referred a friend of his to me. This person was a shopkeeper. He worked at a shop, and he was overweight. He was a smoker, also occasionally drank alcohol. He had hypertension, high blood pressure, the classical profile for someone who would be at risk for this. So one day he was tending to his shop, and a couple of kids came in and asked for a certain brand of candy, and the guy just looks at him. He just doesn't understand what they're asking for. He can hear them, but he cannot understand what they're saying. So then, and then, so those kids, they reported this to some other person who was there, uh, but then he snapped out of it, right? And so then he told me that he also had these prior episodes where he just kind of zoned out, okay? And so based on his signs and symptoms, I told him he was at high risk for transient ischemic attack, and that's what it sounds like a mini stroke. So one thing that I did on the spot for him, and that is an easy test, is something called a, the test for a carotid bruit, okay? A carotid bruit test. And how you do this is you take a stethoscope and you use the other end of the stethoscope, not the flat diaphragm, but the back area, which is called the bell. And you put the bell right here where your carotid artery is, right? And you take a listen. If you hear this whooshing sound with each heartbeat, it's like whoosh, whoosh, it's not your regular heartbeat. You can hear it on the other side for comparison, right? So that's called a bruit. A bruit is this like added sound that any fluid flowing through a narrowed passage makes. So that tells you if there's a carotid bruit that this patient has some kind of a blood clot or atherosclerosis or fatty plaque, which is starting to clog his or her carotid artery. And sooner or later, this is going to impact uh, the blood flow to the brain. All right. So check for carotid bruits. And for diagnosis, you can also do things like a carotid Doppler ultrasounds, which will show you for sure if there is a blockage or impending blockage in the carotid artery. All right, next up, we're looking at what are called the cerebral nuclei, and these are nucleuses which are embedded within your cerebrum, therefore the name. And what they do is they help you with involuntary movements, like when you walk, the way you move your hands, that's involuntary, the way you stand. All of those are regulated by your cerebral nuclei. So there's one called the caudate nucleus. As you can see here, it produces the pattern and rhythm of your walking movements. Then you have something called a lentiform nucleus just around your diencephalon in the mid part of the brain. It has two areas, the putamen and the globus pallidus. The putamen helps control movements at a subconscious level, right? Like tilting your head or the way you hold your eyes and stuff. And that while the globus pallidus here, it adjusts your muscle tone. Then you have something called a claustrum. And this processes visual information at a subconscious level. Many a times you see something, but you're in deep thought, so you're not thinking about it, but that image is in your mind. And that might account for deja vu, that feeling, right? Sometimes when you pass a certain place or you see someone and you think this has happened before, maybe it has happened before, you were simply not paying attention, but at a subconscious level, you had that memory, something in your claustrum. And then you have this region called the amygdaloid body. This is quite important, the amygdala. It's right here in your temporal lobe. It's part of your limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain. And what the amygdala does is it basically, it's your fear center, okay? It, it regulates fear. Uh, and so in people with larger than normal amygdala, they could become phobic, lots of fear. People with damaged amygdala, they become fearless. They did these experiments on animals where they lost their fear completely when the amygdaloid body was destroyed, all right? So here in this picture, you can look at those cerebral nuclei and where they are located at deep within the cerebrum, as seen here. Okay, headaches. Obviously, what causes headaches is not problems with the brain itself, because the brain itself is insensitive. It does not have any sensory nerves, but it's caused by uh, blood pulsations, blood pulsing through the arteries of the brain, through the cerebral blood vessels, all right? And a specific type of headache, which is mentioned here, is a migraine headache, which is like this half-headed, intense pain, all right? So you have two types of migraine. You have what is called the common migraine uh, versus something called classic migraine, all right? How are these two differentiated? In classic migraine, you get an aura, like flashing lights, a certain smell, or you start feeling cold or hot, some kind of a signal that a major attack is on the way, all right? The common migraine, which is much more common, it does not have an aura. Almost both of the migraines are associated with nausea and vomiting. Okay, and so migraine attacks are a result of your blood vessels, cerebral blood vessels, uh, dilating too much and then overcontracting after, actually overcontracting first and then over dilating. So all of a sudden, first the blood is, there's very little flow of blood, and then they start pulsating. So a lot of blood is let loose at the same time, and that causes that pounding headache that you suffer from. All right, and there's many risk factors for that: hormonal imbalances, like your menstrual cycle. Sometimes you're more prone to the migraine because of the fluctuations in the hormones. Uh, a noisy atmosphere, bright lights, certain strong smells, anything can trigger this. It's a vascular phenomenon, though it has to do with your blood vessels more than the brain. Cerebral palsy, it's a damage to your brain because of lack of oxygen supply. It usually happens in newborns who had a protracted birth, right? Uh, uh, so, for example, someone who was being born with in a breech delivery. A breech delivery is when your bottom end comes out first, instead instead of your head, right? Uh, and so, of course, if your head is still inside and you come out bottom first, if this your head is still uh, you're unable to breathe because the umbilical cord is severed at that point. If it takes more than 5 to 6 minutes, then you can develop permanent brain damage because of lack of oxygen supply, and that might affect your muscles, your IQ, your brain functioning, all kinds of things. Okay, Huntington's disease is a genetic illness. Unfortunately, it presents uh, kind of late, in your late 20s to early 30s. By that time, most people have already reproduced, and the children also inherit the disease. There's no treatment for it, and this is what makes it that much more tragic, that you have the knowledge that you and your children are probably not going to make it, and you pass it on to them unknowingly. Parkinson's disease, this is a disease caused by a lack of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain. All right, and what happens here is a lack of dopamine neurons in an area of the brain called the substantia nigra, or the black part of the brain. All right, and Parkinson's disease again has a genetic component. Many studies have shown like repeated trauma to the head can also result in Parkinson's disease. So the problem is with initiating movement. So you have this very stiff gait, kind of like a masked face, right? Um, uh, Also slow reflexes, all of those things, and how you can treat it or try to pacify the signs and symptoms is by giving them drugs like levodopa, which is a dopamine substitute. So they're low on dopamine. Interestingly, if you have low dopamine in the brain, right, then you develop low dopaminergic activity, then you get Parkinson's disease, where you slow down all over. But if you have too much dopamine, then you become schizophrenic. Interestingly, right? Your thought patterns go too crazy, too much activity in the brain, schizophrenia. So again, it's best to be in the middle, homeostasis. General function of the cerebrum, it makes you who you are, right? Um, it is the thinking, the emotion, not the emotional, the thinking part of the brain. Okay, so your critical thinking skills, your ethics, morality, judgment, all of that, music, art, literature, analysis, science, that's all cerebrum. Corpus callosum, it connects the two halves of the brain together. Five cerebral lobes: frontal lobe for personality, temporal lobes for what? For smell and taste, parietal lobes for movement and sensations, occipital lobe for visual function. Whereas each of the motor areas located uh, in the precentral gyrus, and they control your muscles. What is the purpose of the association areas? They make sense of your five senses, right? They make sense of what you're looking at. Why does the prefrontal cortex perform differently in a teenager? Because it's still developing. It does not develop completely till 25 years of age. What portions of the brain are linked by each type of tract? Association tracts, areas within the same hemisphere. Commissural tracts, areas in between the two hemispheres. And projection tracts, the higher centers of the brain connected to the brain stem, and vice versa. All right, so then what are the primary functions of the left cerebral hemisphere? Analysis, science, math, logic, all here. Right cerebral hemisphere, creative arts, music, literature, philosophy, religion, it's all here. General function of the cerebral nuclei, they control your subconscious motor activities. Anatomic components of the nuclei: claustrum, striatum, um, lentiform nucleus, amygdaloid body, all of those. All right, so next up, we are here talking about the diencephalon, and this is the middle part of the brain. Again, here's your thalamus, which is the egg-shaped area, right behind which is the pineal gland in the epithalamus. Here is the hypothalamus, just underneath the thalamus, and then here's your pituitary gland, right? Pituitary gland. So very active area of the brain right here. You can see part of the cerebellum here. You see the corpus callosum at the top as well. So the pineal gland is this little pea-sized area that controls your circadian rhythm, your sleep and wakefulness cycle, and it does this by means of secreting a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin puts you to sleep. Uh, People having problems with their sleep wakefulness cycle, they can develop something like seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, where they literally become sad during the winter months because the um, sunlight hours are less and the darkness hours are long, so their melatonin secretion goes down, and that makes them depressed. Okay, so then you have something called the habenular nucleus in that area, and that gives an emotional twist to the odors that are wafting into your nostrils. All right. So, for example, you smell a certain cologne and transports you all the way back into your childhood when your favorite teacher or favorite person wore that perfume. That would be the emotional component would be your habenular nucleus. Thalamus is again your what was that? It's the post office of the brain. So it basically processes all of the incoming information and sends it to the appropriate areas of the brain. Okay. Hypothalamus, the 4Fs region, controls your vital functions like respiration, digestion, blood pressure. It releases many hormones that control your endocrine system, regulates your body temperature, food and water intake, and your emotional behavior. The 4Fs again. Here is your hypothalamus. Look at that, so many nuclei, important nuclei, all crammed into that small area. No wonder that is one of my all-time favorite areas to study, right? So the location and function of the pineal gland, just posterior to the hypothalamus. Function, it releases melatonin. General function of the thalamus, post office of the brain. How does the hypothalamus control our feelings of hunger and thirst? It tells you when to stop and not to overeat, and when not to, and when to eat a little bit more, right? Same with your thirst. And sometimes things can go wrong uh, with those. So if you have a stroke or an injury or a tumor maybe in that area in the hypothalamus, you can have things like what is called the Kluver-Bucy syndrome. Okay, interesting ones. Kluver-Bucy syndrome, or something called the Klein-Levin syndrome. Okay, both of these are marked by hyperphagia, hyperphagia, and hypersexuality. Okay, and also hypersomnolence. So these people tend to eat out of proportion. They don't know when to stop. They are expressing inappropriate sexual behavior, hypersexual behavior, and they are sleeping for much longer than what is required. All right. So all of the basic 4Fs functions, as I talked about before, right? So look those two up, very interesting syndromes. So I'm going to share these notes with you as well. All right, down to the brainstem. Here's the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So let's take a look at what is found here. Within the midbrain, you have what are called the cerebral peduncles. They carry voluntary motor commands from your primary motor cortex, so concerned with your muscle movement, right? Superior cerebellar peduncles connect the cerebellum to the midbrain, the superior peduncles. And then the substantia nigra, this is where you have dopamine receptors. So if you have a lack of dopamine here, that's when you get Parkinson's disease, okay? So there, uh, this area called the superior colliculus, okay? What it does is it provides for visual tracking. Visual tracking is your ability to follow an object with your eyes, right? Kids don't have it. If you move in front of an infant or a newborn's face, if you go like this, well, they're all over the place, right? So you learn this visual tracking with time. So that's the functioning of your superior colliculus, okay? Then the reticular formation, this one gets you awake after you're sleeping, and we'll get into this here shortly. Then the substantia nigra, it's blackish in color here. This is where you have the dopaminergic neurons, any lack of dopamine here, and you have Parkinson's disease, okay? Then comes the pons. What do you have in the pons? Important centers. The pontine respiratory center, your breathing center, is found here, as is your superior olivary nucleus. And these ones help with sound localization. Somebody calls your name from the right-hand side, you turn your head to the right-hand side, or the left, you turn there. If you're turning your head in the wrong direction, something is wrong with your brain stem here at the superior, or maybe you have wax in your ear canals, right? So there you have it. You have the middle cerebellar peduncles. They connect the pons with the cerebellum for muscle memory and muscle control again. And then you have what else? The respiratory center, very important, of the pons here, right? And then the superior olivary nuclei or nucleuses, which help with sound localization, as we mentioned before. Medulla oblongata, okay? And so what do we have in the medulla oblongata? The important centers here are, let's see, the inferior olivary nucleus. This has to do with visual localization again, right? And the nuclei of all of these cranial nerves emerge uh, from the medulla oblongata as well, of cranial nerve number 8, vestibulocochlear nerve, hypoglossal nerve, all of these vagus nerve, nerve number 10, these important nerves, they all emerge from your medulla oblongata. Your medulla oblongata also has your blood pressure controlling vasoactive center, your vasomotor center, your respiratory center, and also your uh, cardiac center for controlling your heart rate. All of those functions are here, as you can see. Respiratory centers, right? And the cardiovascular center. It's found in the brain stem. And that's why really bad whiplash injury, right? Such as when you're rear-ended by a big truck or something, if it's severe enough, it can kill you because it's going to crush the whiplash will basically stun your brain stem, especially your medulla oblongata, or death by hanging. Same thing. Death by hanging is not caused because of asphyxiation. It's not that you stop breathing or something. Well, you do stop breathing, but it's not because you choke. Death by hanging is instantaneous. It happens because of the jolt that you suffer here, um, your vertebrae, they fracture and they crush your brainstem. Therefore, your respiratory and your cardiac centers stop immediately. All right, what is the function of the substantia nigra? Dopamine secretion. What disease? Parkinson's disease. What part of the brain, midbrain, contains paired visual and auditory sensory nuclei? The colliculi, the superior and inferior colliculi. General function of the pontine respiratory center, control respiration. Where are the pyramids located in your brainstem? Their function, pyramids basically are the regions uh, of the brainstem where the uh, cranial nerves cross over. So right side of the brain controls the left half of the body and vice versa, okay? What are the main autonomic centers located in the medulla? Your respiratory center, your cardiac center, and your blood pressure controlling vasomotor center, okay? So next up, you are looking at the cerebellum, okay? Here's the cerebellum. It has been transected for you to look at the insides, the arbor vitae, the tree of life, the white matter that you see here. What does it do? Muscle memory and muscle coordination. You need this to drive, to play ping pong, to have muscle memory of any sort, to dance, whatever, swim, all of those. They're all here. And you can see that the cerebellum is connected to all three areas of your brainstem by means of these three peduncles. The superior cerebellar peduncle connects it to the midbrain, the middle cerebellar peduncle connects it to the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects it to the medulla oblongata. So it has an input and feedback to all of the brainstem areas and vice versa. It fine-tunes movement, maintains your equilibrium and your posture, as you can see here, okay? So when the cop pulls you over and asks you to close your eyes and try to walk in a straight line, he's trying to determine if you're driving under the influence because your cerebellum is under the influence and you won't be able to do that. So anyone suffering any injury or tumor in that area, you do these similar tests. You might ask them to touch their fingers here and then to their nose alternatively. So if they have problems with the cerebellum, they'll be going all over the place, not able to do this touch finger test. Let's call it that. Touch finger test for cerebellar function, okay? Or walk in a straight line with your eyes closed. Okay, so yes, primary anatomic components of the cerebellum. There's a cerebellar cortex on the outside. There's arbor vitae on the inside, and cerebellar medulla. The middle cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum to which part of the brainstem? The mid part of the mid of the brainstem, which is the pons. Functions of the cerebellum: muscle memory, muscle coordination. Okay. So then next up, we are looking at the limbic system. And the limbic system is the emotional part of the brain. And it's again located all around the hypothalamus. In fact, the term limbic means around. So it's forming a boundary next to the what? Next to your hypothalamus. So remember, for limbic system, there are two emotional areas which are quite important, all right? And those two important regions of the limbic system are the amygdala and the hippocampus, okay? Why? The amygdala is your fear center. Your fear and violence and sexual behavior are all located here. So sex and violence, the infamous duo, I should say. It's located here in the amygdala, okay? Interesting that the same area which is responsible for procreation is intimately linked to violence. And maybe not so surprising, because if you look at many of these wild creatures, the courtship and the copulation act almost looks violent, right? Like the big cats, as an example, felines, leopards, and lions, and even in like domestic cats, it looks quite violent, right? So closely associated. Hippocampus is all about forming memories. All right, that's the memory center of your brain. But do remember that memories are stored all over the brain, so you cannot just pinpoint specific memories just to the hippocampus. Any damage to any area of the brain, and you might lose a host of memories from there. All right. Okay, next up, we are looking at different pathologic states of unconsciousness. All right, fainting, brief loss of consciousness. It could be because of emotional reasons, something called vasovagal syncope. It could be because of cardiovascular trouble, not enough blood going to your brain. It could be more serious, like cardiac arrhythmias causing fainting, or low glucose levels, or maybe even a blood clot blocking your cerebral blood vessels. Stupor, you are in a deep state of unconsciousness. It's seen in people with liver or kidney disease, people who have like diabetic ketoacidosis and stuff like that, brain trauma, certain drug use like morphine, opiates, and opioid overdose, right? Um, these are the leading causes of death in America at present, right? They're showing an exponential growth: opioid overuse and suicides, an upward trend, right? Uh, so be on the lookout for that. Coma, deep and profound unconsciousness, again, diabetic ketoacidosis, trauma to the head, electrolyte abnormalities, hyponatremia, hyperkalemia, very low blood sugar. Certain drugs can put you into a coma as well. Persistent vegetative state is when you are brain dead. There's no activity in the brain. The EEG is not picking up any activity, but since your brain stem is still functioning, you're breathing, your pulse is still going, but there's no active uh, thinking or anything going on in your cerebral cortex. Components of the limbic system, talked about the mammillary bodies, amygdala, hippocampus, all of them. The main functions of the limbic system: emotions. There's the emotional part of the brain. How's the reticular? Okay, so we're going to talk about the reticular activating system here. The reticular activating system, or RAS, is your body's built-in alarm clock. And we have all noticed it, right? Let's say you have to wake up at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, and you forget to set up your alarm, or you do not have alarm, or whatever. Magically, somehow, you will wake up exactly at 6 o'clock, right? That's the function of your reticular activating system. These are some nerve fibers that run from your brainstem to the higher centers of the cerebral cortex, and they act as alarm clock. So at a given time, the reticular activating system will light up your brain, just like it'll start firing signals, and it's time to wake up, right? Uh, so that's what it is. Okay. Higher order mental functions take place in the cerebral cortex up here mostly. Most of the brain development takes place during the first 2 years of life. So expose your children to all kinds of stimuli, as I was mentioning before, right? The brain keeps developing for the longest time. Uh, Till 25 years of age, your prefrontal cortex is still developing, right? Okay, so EEG is used to pick up things like epileptic activity in the brain, even your sleep waves. Here are your sleep waves. So when you awake and alert, you have what are called beta waves, right? So you're focusing here. beta. Actually, you have gamma waves, which are the most intense focused concentration. Then awake with mental activity, like normal mental activity, is beta waves, right? Then alpha wave is when you're like in a relax, your eyes are closed, you're listening to calming music, alpha waves. Look at the frequency is decreasing. Then when you are drifting off to sleep, theta phase over there. And then when you're in deep sleep, delta phase, when look at the frequency, all right? So these are the different stages of sleep. Uh, and we keep drifting in and out of those, right? So sleep is divided into what is called REM for rapid eye movement versus non-REM sleep. 75% of the time you are in non-REM sleep, okay? So that is when your brain is making connections, rejuvenating itself, clearing off all the day's exhaustion and everything, right? Rapid eye movement sleep is about 25% of the time. And this is when you're vividly dreaming. This is when your pupils are moving behind your eyes, behind your closed eyes. This is when you have some of your most vivid dreams during the REM sleep, okay? The dreams that you wake up to and you remember, or nightmares for that matter. If you read my book on Amazon, I deal with this topic at length in an article called The Origin of Dreams and Nightmares, and also something called The Succubus Story. So I hope you enjoy those as well. So I go over all of these things, the stages of sleep and whatnot. So try to sleep 7 to 8 hours is the general recommendation. Lack of sleep is unhealthy. It's one of the things in my health mantra as well, if you remember. Insomnia is difficulty falling asleep, could be due to drugs, due to caffeine before bedtime, exercise, even listening to music. So try to stick to a healthy sleep routine. Sleep apnea is when you stop breathing while you're sleeping at regular intervals. It could be obstructive sleep apnea because you're overweight, high blood pressure, you have metabolic syndrome, so you should lose weight, be physically active to get rid of it. Sometimes you will still need CPAP. That stands for continuous positive airway pressure. It's a machine that force feeds your lungs with oxygen, as an example, right? Cognition are your higher mental functions, as you see here. Uh, and if there's any injury, like a stroke or actual trauma to the brain, then you can develop things like agnosia, where you are unable to make sense of sounds or words. So you could understand English previously, but after a stroke, you cannot understand anything, right? Memory, it's stored all over the brain, not in one area, but the more that you repeat something, it transfers from short-term memory circuits to long-term memory circuits. All right. So repetition is the key, even for mastering your exams, repetition at regular intervals, and getting good sleep along with that, right? So another case that comes to my mind, pre-stroke and post-stroke, was uh, my come on, gave out on me. Come on. Okay, so just make a note here. Uh, my middle school language teacher, right? Used to be the calmest, the nicest, the most competent person I ever knew. Got a stroke, unfortunately, came back after a year or so, recuperating, and then was fired from teaching on his return after a few months because of accusations of child abuse, okay, which were proven to be true. Became a pedophile, basically. What happened? At that point, I couldn't make any sense of it. I was early on in my career. Now it makes perfect sense. So that the stroke obviously somehow affected the area of his brain where the prefrontal cortex lost connection with the emotional, with the limbic system. And so he could, all of those uncontrollable urges and whatnot. So, all right. Alzheimer's disease, genetic, more common in females after 60 years of age. All right. No known treatment. There are drugs to slow down the progression, but there's no treatment for it. And what you see here in the brain is a shrinking of the brain, actual shrinkage, as well as what are called uh, plaques or neurofibrillary tangles in your brain. So those are dying proteins, clumps of proteins that are accumulating in your brain. Okay. Amnesia is a loss of memory, either because of trauma to the head or direct brain injury. Okay, some of those memories could be recalled, some could be permanently lost, depending on the type and how severe that amnesia is. Again, if you read my book, The Survivors, I talk about this anterograde and retrograde amnesia to some extent. Emotions, amygdala and hippocampus are the most important ones in your limbic system. I talked about that. Language is again located in those two areas primarily, the Wernicke's area here in the temporal cortex, and also the Broca's area, which is in the frontal cortex. Okay, and so there could be problems with your speech if those brain areas are affected, right? Like dull emotional speech, emotionless speech, something called aprosodia. If there's a lesion to the right hemisphere, opposite the Wernicke area, apraxia, they cannot speak properly. They know what they want to say, but they cannot get it out. Apraxia or aphasia, where you do not understand or comprehend speech, even though you were able to do it previously. Dyslexia, also called the disconnect syndrome. So here you have average or above average intelligence, but when it comes to like writing words or even reading them, you don't see words normally. Sometimes they would be inverted. That's how you see them. You write them like upside down or backs forward, side backward, things like that. That's why it's called the disconnect syndrome. And many famous people have suffered from dyslexia as well, right? So what are some of the implications? That it doesn't develop until the mid-teens? Don't give your car to your teenage son or daughter to drive, please, and get in a wreck. No, you know what I'm saying. And it's not that they want to, it's just that their prefrontal cortex is still developing. EEG may be used to diagnose things like sleep stages, sleep studies, as well as what? As well as epileptic seizures. Non-REM and REM sleep. REM sleep is when you have vivid dreams, rapid movement, eyeball movements, 25% of the times. Non-REM sleep is when you are deep asleep and your body's rejuvenating itself for 75% of the times. Definition of cognition, higher critical thinking skills. What type of study habits are best? Constant repetition and getting good sleep. What portions of the brain and limbic system involved with modulation of emotion? The hippocampus and amygdala. How is the Wernicke area involved in language processing? It makes sense of what you're listening to, okay? So finally, these are your 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The first one is the olfactory nerve. It helps you smell. It's for smelling. Second is your optic nerve for seeing, optic, as you can see here. Oculomotor nerve, we talked about that one, controls your eye muscles, except for the lateral rectus, which is supplied by the abducens nerve, right? Trochlear nerve, this supplies your superior oblique eye muscles. We talked about that one as well. Trigeminal nerve is nerve number 5. It supplies the skin of the face, and some of the muscles of the face as well, all right? Like the chewing muscles. Abducens nerve, it controls and supplies your lateral rectus muscle for looking sideways. Cranial nerve number 7 is facial nerve, the main nerve of facial expression, very important. All right, facial expression and also taste from your tongue. Number 8, vestibulocochlear nerve for hearing and also for balance maintenance, equilibrium, as you see here. Glossopharyngeal nerve, the name tells you all, for carrying taste and touch from your tongue. Number 10 is vagus nerve, quite important. It supplies all of your viscera, your digestive organs, your heart, your lungs, all of the systems, vagus nerve, number 10. And what it does is it calms those down. It's a parasympathetic nerve. It makes you breathe easy, your heart goes slower. You can go to the bathroom and void your bowels or bladder, whatever. That's what the vagus nerve does. Accessory nerve, it controls the muscles of your neck and the throat region. And finally, hypoglossal nerve, again, found under the tongue, hypoglossal, controls tongue muscles. All right, which cranial nerves have sensory functions only? That would be your optic nerve, your olfactory nerve. Optic and olfactory nerve, only sensations, all right? Smelling and vision. Okay, so believe it or not, it's all done. All right, good luck on your test. I have sent out all the study guides as of now, so use those to the best of your advantage. Make use of extra credit, whatever comes your way. All the best. Have a wonderful rest of the evening, and I'll see you all virtually tomorrow with chapter 14. All right. Have a good one. Bye-bye.